So for those of you who handed in that homework a long time ago, I still have a few here in case you want them back, right, after the class, right? Okay, let's hurry this one along. All right, you have like a minute or so left. Okay, so last answers coming in, and then we're going to close it. Okay. Okay, so the question was, if the elasticity of demand is -3, the elasticity of supply is -2, and supply shifts by 2%, then the quantity exchange declines by 6%. Okay? Who wants to give me the answer on that one here? We have a majority on false. Okay. Anybody who wants to actually answer or explain the answer? The correct answer is false. Why? Why, sir? Okay, so somebody who said false and who could explain it, or anybody who could just explain it. What was your name? Shane. Shane?
It's dictated on which way the shift in the 2% shift is. So if it's positive, 6%, but it may be positive or negative.
So why would it not be uncertain then?
Because it's a blanket statement that is saying it will.
No, actually, no, I didn't trick you like that. I was in fact thinking of. Actually, no, I don't think the way the answer allows for even that interpretation. Well, I guess it would, right? I guess it would allow for that interpretation, but it's clearly false. It cannot be true, regardless which way it shifts. So even if the supply shifts inwards by 2%, the quantity exchanged will not decline by 6%. Can you give that a shot? So you were a little more legalistic, I guess, than I intended this to be. So if the supply shifts in by 2%, right? If the price changes by 2%, declines. If the price increases by 2%, right? What would happen to the quantity exchanged? What is your name? David. What happens to the quantity exchange if the price increases by 2%? By how much? So if the price, no, not certain amount actually, right? I give you here that the elasticity of demand is 3, right? What is an elasticity? What is your name? Sei Peng. So what's an elasticity? So if the, no, actually, we're on a different question. If the price increases by 2%, okay, and the elasticity of demand is -3, right? What happens to the quantity exchanged? It goes down by 6%, right? Okay, so that is if the price changes by 6%, right? So if you have a demand function with an elasticity of -3, right? So the elasticity on this thing is -3. What is an elasticity, I asked in between? More precisely, what is an elasticity? No, actually, I want a definition of an elasticity. Like when I say it's -3, it speaks to what you're correct. It speaks to how the responsivity or how, I don't know, I remember exactly what you said, right? But there's an exact definition for what elasticity is. No, it's not the slope. It's the percentage change with respect to a percentage change in the input, right? So if the price increases by 2% and the elasticity is -3, right, then the quantity here would have to change by -6% as the price increases by 2%, right? Why? Because the elasticity of demand times the percentage change in the price, that's going to be equal to the change along this demand function, right? Now I'm a little disappointed that you don't like, I think I spent tremendous amount of time on trying to explain to you that this is about percentage changes and how you translate percentage changes of one argument into percentage changes of the other, the quantities in this case, using the elasticity. Right? And this is something you need to get down, because if you don't, you'll be screwed. Okay, so now why therefore, but what's different here? Here I asked, what about if supply shifts by 2%? Right? If supply shifts by 2%, let's say it shifts inwards by 2%, okay? I should have done this differently, forget this number here. Then this would be a shift of 2%, okay? Right? But because this shifts by 2%, we're going to now move back up the supply function. Right? So only if the supply function was actually perfectly inelastic, would the quantity also shift then exactly by 2%. It's going to have to shift by less than the shift in the supply function. So this is just false. Okay? Alright? So you need to start handling these elasticities. So let's ask another one. Okay, so forget about the bad English in the title of the question. The quantity exchange declines by more, right? Kind of like have two declines in there. This is the easier of these two questions, right? So let's get the answers coming in here. So supply shifts, it's going to shift inwards, so the price is increased by 3%, right? So you have everything you need to answer the question right there. Except for the bad English, obviously. All right, we have a minute to go. All right, let's get the last answers in here. I'm going to close this down. Oh, you're in the wrong session, right? You signed up for the wrong section. Yes. You're in section 2, so email Top Hat. Get in contact with Top Hat and get yourself reassigned to the new session, to the section 1. This is section 1. If any of you is in section 2 and they can't see these questions on their computer, that's because you're in the wrong section. So you need to get in contact with Top Hat and get yourself reassigned to the right section. All right? Okay. So let's see what the vote is here. Okay, so somebody wants, so here we have a pretty decent majority for false. Okay, anybody thinks that this is any of those who want to change their opinion? Who's the uncertain person? Who said uncertain? Don't be shy. You're shy. Alright, so anybody who wants to explain, the right answer here is false. Why? You had your chance, sir. What is your name? Yeah. What was your name, for? Philo.
As price increases,
Yes?
if the elasticity, like if the good is elastic,
Yeah.
the decrease in quantity demand is more.
Yeah, so as Shane earlier said, and what was your name? I forgot. Demi, right? The elasticity says something about how responsive a function is, right? As the price increases, we're going to move along the demand function. If the elasticity is larger, so the function is more elastic, right? The response is going to be greater. The demand function is in a graph would look flat, more like flatter. Okay? Right, so this one doesn't. This one really just requires your understanding that the elasticity has something to do with the responsiveness of the function. Okay? The one before had a little bit to do with that you actually understand how to use elasticities. Alright? Okay. So, let's do something new. So this was basically a review from last time. Are there questions so far? No? Ah, yes. What is the question? What is your name?
Noah.
Noah.
So in the last question, you also said that the supply changed as well. How does that affect?
So here I just said, in the last question, right? I said, okay, we have a supply and demand, nothing much, right? I don't say anything about demand, so all else equal on the demand side, and supply shifts, and that leads to a change in price. Okay? In this particular case, the change in price was 3%. So the fact that I say that supply shifts just gives me a reason why the price changed. It's not a shift in the demand function. And then the question is, how much does the quantity exchange changes? So if the demand function is flatter, that quantity exchange will change by more, right? In fact, how much will the quantity exchange change? dq in percent, dq over q would be equal to what? Elasticity of demand times 3%, right? So that's right, exactly right, right? I said that the price changes 3%. So if the price changes by 3%, the elasticity of demand, let's say, is 2, right? Then the quantity exchanged, well, it's minus 2, right? So then the quantity exchanged would change by minus 2 times 3%, so it changed by minus 6%, right? The elasticity of demand is larger, so this function is more elastic. If it's minus 5, then the quantity exchanged will change by minus 15%. Okay? Alright. So we talked about supply and demand, and what we're going to start doing now is we're going to start thinking about welfare analysis using supply and demand. Okay? So welfare analysis is essentially an attempt to say something about the losses due to changes in the policy, right? Who gains, who losses as prices change. Okay? And when we speak here about who gains and who losses, well, we are using the supply and demand model, so we're just going to ask, do the suppliers gain and lose? Do the demanders gain or lose? Do both of them gain? Do both of them lose? Okay? That's the kind of question we're asking here. Okay? And, well, the other thing to think what I want to think about is here, once we start thinking about gains and losses, right, the competitive model with free markets, right, where the government doesn't interfere, well, that suggests in our model that the market price is going to be such that markets clear, right? We're going to go to that intersection between supply and demand. Everything functions just smoothly, okay? Then a lot of people think that that's a good way to allocate resources, right? You see how, when I say allocate resources here, right? If I think about a market, in which sense do I speak about, what does it mean that I say allocation of resources, right? I have a demand side, I have a supply side. The competitive market solution is going to find a price and a quantity, okay? And then we can speak about allocation of resources in the sense that every person demanding the good sitting on this side of the demand function is going to receive the good and going to pay the price P, right? With like that dollar amount, that's just an access to other resources. That's what money is, right? And similarly, the firms or the suppliers sitting on the supply function to the left of it, they're going to supply Q and they're going to be allocated the price P. So in that sense, this model here gives you a description of who gets allocated what, right? After the market clears, a bunch of people you can think of now have money in their hands, a bunch of other people have less money in their hands and have the good. They have been allocated the resources in this economy. Okay, so why is that a good way of allocating resources is going to be a question, and it's good for whom? Right? When we say it's a good way of allocating resources, I think it is too often a good way of allocating resources. I think an interesting question to ask is in what sense good? What does good mean? And, well, good for whom? Well, having money is always better than not having money, right? But it's not clear that this outcome will particularly benefit the people who have money or who don't have money, right? But of course, yes, in a grander scheme of things, if you have access to resources, something went right for you, right? So, okay. But then when we're going to compare, what I'm trying to say here is, you might compare this with a system where the price is not set by the market clearing condition. Other people are going to end up with money, and other people are going to end up with resources, and some people are going to end up with less of both or more of both. And in what sense is this good or bad? Okay, that's the kind of question that I want to start talking about. Okay? So that's the question of who benefits when the government starts interfering in the market. Okay? The government being just this amorphous, stuff that we vote for or sometimes don't vote for and so on and so forth. Okay. And then you can start asking questions about if you want to interfere in the market because you want to affect who gets what, right? Who gets allocated resources? Are there better ways and worse ways to achieve these goals, right? So what type of instruments would you want to tend to favor as opposed to disfavor to achieve allocative goals? Okay? So those are the type of questions that I want to start thinking about, and if I want to start thinking about those, I have to have some opinion or some systematic description about who benefits from exchange here, right? So the answers that we're going to give are going to be within this one market. We're going to give that in partial equilibrium. Okay, so anybody remembers what general equilibrium is? Talked about that in like lecture 1 or 2. Give me your name again. Demi?
Is it general equilibrium when
So that's equilibrium. So when we think about equilibrium in this market here, the competitive equilibrium in any single market was that the price is such that the market clears, so the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded equal in this market, right? But what's partial about this equilibrium? Let's say that's the market for coffee. What's partial in this equilibrium? Ryan?
There's only one good coffee, the only good. But there's only one good being examined. All
Yes.
the other fads of the economy are
not all of the other goods, right? So we are thinking about once, but your tendency of your answer is correct. When we analyze things here, we are thinking about it with only one good, right, Demi? But we are consuming hundreds of goods, thousands of goods. There are in fact like probably millions of goods that we could consume, right? And we are not thinking about the repercussions of this market to all of the other markets, right? So general equilibrium, a general competitive equilibrium, would be one where the supply and demand equal in every single market, right? And then you have to start thinking about the interplay of the different markets. So how does the market for coffee affect the market for tea and so on and so forth? Okay? Since that is a lot more complicated, and we're only going to maybe start talking at it at the end of this semester. Okay? All right. So what are we going to do? We're going to think about welfare in the context of this one market, and we're going to use terms, or we're going to introduce concepts called consumer surplus, producer surplus, and we're going to ask the question, when is consumer and producer surplus largest, right? And the answer to that is going to be in competitive equilibrium. Okay? When is the sum of them the largest in the competitive equilibrium? Okay? So anybody has heard of these terms, consumer and producer surplus? Okay, there's still a bunch of you, so all right, let me just move on though. Okay, so consumer surplus, right? When we thought about what is a demand function, okay, one way that I described it is to say, well, the demand function is the willingness to pay for a marginal unit. Okay? So when I think about a demand function, okay, and I ask at this quantity here, what's the value of that quantity, right? The value of that quantity if it's optimally allocated to those people who, all the previous quantities were given to the people who liked them most, right? Well, it's going to be the height of the demand function, right? In what sense? Well, the person that receives, that sits here, that marginal unit, right? That person would be willing to give up exactly, in my example, $5 to get the coffee, right? Does that make sense? Well, you can start playing this game anywhere along the demand function, right? So I think Ryan had a willingness to pay for coffee, which was like $50 or something to that, for his first coffee of the day. Maybe not 50, let's say 20, right? Okay. So his willingness to pay for his first coffee was $20. If he has a choice between not receiving any coffee or one coffee, he would be willing to pay $20 for that. And then we moved down the demand function and kind of have a decreasing willingness to pay, right? And because it's a law of demand, every next unit was worth less, right? So when you ask, if I sell Ryan a coffee for $5 and otherwise he would receive no dollars, how much better is he off? Well, he's going to be better off by $15, right? By something to the equivalent of $15. Okay? And the next person for the second unit, right, would be better off by whatever that would be, like $14.50 or something, right? And you can move along and you can basically add up all of these values, these marginal values, and you will get the total amount of value created for consumers in this market if coffee sells at $5 by integrating or summing up or getting the area, this area here. Okay? Why not this area here as well? Shamil?
It's because they don't buy the coffee.
Well, they have to pay something for the coffee, right? So every single one has to receive, like Ryan receives a total value in some sense of $20 by getting the coffee, but he has to pay $5 for it. So net, he receives 15. Yes. What was your name?
Andrew.
Andrew.
That's the minimum you pay, 'cause that's what the
No, that's, I just said like if the price is $5, right? So let's just say if the equilibrium price was $5, but whatever, if the price is $5, then in this market, that would be the value created. If the price is $3, right, then more value would be created for consumers for two reasons, right? One, this whole block here would now go over to the consumer side, right? Because they have to pay less. So for each unit that they purchased already, they pay less. So they would get a $2 benefit from that. Okay, so the extra value created would be 2 times this Q here. But then also some new people are coming into the game. And they get value from buying. Right? So the total value then would be this full area here. Okay? Does this concept of consumer surplus make sense? Yes. What is your name? I'm sorry. Penelope, yes. You're like switching back and forth. And okay.
It means that if we look at the consumer surplus, we are regarding the value created for the consumer, not the one which the supplier is getting.
So right now we're looking just to the consumer side, so just on the demand side, right? But don't rush. We're also going to think about the suppliers.
So it means that when we look at the consumer surplus, we are looking at what he is kind of winning, like the money he's...
The value, the equivalent in money that consumers get for participating in this market. So the fact that it's possible for consumers to buy a coffee at $3, right? That generates value for consumers in this market. And the value for consumers in this market is given by the area under the demand function and above, like less everything that has to be paid for it, which in this case is the price, because everybody pays the same price. Okay? That's for consumers. That's for the demand side. Okay? And just to make sure, where most of the things we talked about before were about the marginal person here, back here, right? This marginal concept was really important. But if you think about the total surplus, right, then all these inframarginal units become important. Okay? And the other thing to recognize is when you think about the fact that this value gets created, right, that also happens because the people who receive the coffee are actually the people who want the coffee most, right? So in this market here, if the coffee is priced at $3, nobody who likes coffee is willing to pay less than $3 for the coffee will purchase the coffee. They will voluntarily just abstain from purchasing the coffee. So the people who receive the coffee will be the people who value the coffee most, right? And that's a beauty of the price system, is that it's voluntary. Like you offer people a price. If that's too much for you, you don't need to purchase the good. Right? So what means that if you only have, let's say, this many units of coffee to sell, Q hat here to sell, right? If you can find the willingness to pay at Q hat, one way of making sure that those people who want the coffee the most will receive the coffee would be to price it at the willingness to pay at that level. Right? If instead you have like a fairness consideration and you say, well, more people want coffee than we actually have, and we're just randomly going to distribute the coffee in the room, that wouldn't take place, right? If I just randomly distribute the coffee in the room, there's a chance that Ryan wouldn't get one, and Ryan really likes his coffee. Okay? Whereas in this market, in this price system, that doesn't happen. Does that make sense to everybody? That's going to come back, right? Okay. Now, Penelope wants to know about the suppliers, right? She's worried that we are focusing too much on these consumers. We also want to know what happens on the supply side, okay? So on the supply side, we're going to do something very similar, right? Okay, well, one more thing. If this function here is linear, right? If the demand function is linear and the price is P, right? And this intercept here is A, and then this quantity here is, let's say, Q1, then that area is really simple to calculate, right? How?
It's Q1, so it's a quantity
Yeah.
times the line from P to A.
So that's the length of that is A minus P, right? Over 2, right? That's just the formula for the area of a triangle. Okay? So just to remind you, a triangle is the base times the height divided by 2. Right? Okay? Right, what, by the way, if that's the price and the quantity exchanged, what would be the revenue in this market? Right, it's just going to be this box here, P times Q1. It's the revenue in this market, okay? P is here, Q1 is here, so the box here. That will be the revenue in the market, okay? All right. Okay, so let's move on to producer surplus. Okay, so somebody remind me what the supply function is. Two ways of representing the supply function, of interpreting a supply function. Philo.
How much the producers are willing to supply of a certain good at every given price.
At a given price, how many units are they willing to sell? Okay, so that's one interpretation. It's a less interesting one in this context. So what's the other one? Theo? How much, I use the term willingness to accept, right? So what does that mean? At what price would, if this is the quantity we're considering, right, then this is the willingness to accept at, let's say, call that Q1, okay? And that means that the supplier at Q1 is just indifferent between selling the good at Q1 for this price here or not, right? So it's in some sense the costs to the firm to actually providing that extra unit, right? Okay. Well, now if the price actually happens to be here, okay, then the value that the firm receives for selling any given unit is this height here, correct? All right. So then you can think about that for the first unit sold, right, the value for the producer, just analogously to the consumer surplus, would be how much they get in the market and at what price they would be completely indifferent between actually selling it, right? So the producer surface is going to be the area under the price line, how much they receive for selling the good, and above the supply function. Okay? Makes sense to everybody? Does it not make sense to somebody? You want me to? Anne? Yeah?
It's the price they're willing to sell their...
No, this is it's a hypothetical price, right? It's a hypothetical price. So it's the price who is willing to sell at. For one of the suppliers, it's the willingness to accept. For this person here, right? For this person here, let's say that's 1,173rd unit in the market, right? The firm that sells that last unit, the supplier that sells that last unit, right? They receive P, and P is exactly what they are willing, at what price they are indifferent, at what price it doesn't matter to them whether they sell the unit or not. Right? If they receive less than P, then they say it's not worth for me. If they receive more than P, they say it's worth it for me. At P, it doesn't really matter either way. Right? So at that level, they're just willing to sell the thing. But this guy here, this firm here that sits at like 773 units, right? This person here would have said, okay, I was willing to sell my coffee at $10, but I actually could get $20 for it. right? So the gain that I'm making from exchanging coffee here is $10, 20 minus 10, right? That's his surplus. And if I sum up all these surpluses, that's the area between the supply function and the price line. That's called the producer surplus. Okay? Fine? All right. Now, this is the way that I've described it here. There's just a unique price, right? Next semester, you're going to start having situations where firms might be able to charge different prices to different consumers or something like that, and then the situation gets a little bit more difficult, right? In general, a supplier's producer surplus is just the difference between her willingness to accept and the payments received, aggregated over all of the units supplied in the market. Okay? In our semester, we're just going to think of one price. All right. And similarly as before, if you know how to calculate the area of a triangle, you know how to calculate the producer surplus if the supply function is linear. Right? Okay. So now let's think about a market and there's a demand function, there's a supply function, right? Okay. And let's assume that this market is a competitive market. So the actually let's do this different. Okay. Let's assume you have no problems assigning if a good gets produced, right? Let's say you are a social dictator and a good gets produced. Okay? You can assign that good to the person who has the highest willingness to pay. So you're like this omniscient, all-knowing social dictator, benevolent dictator, okay? So you have no problem with making sure that if a good gets assigned to somebody, the person that it gets assigned to will be the person that values it the most. And you also have no problem making sure that the firm that supplies the good is the firm with the lowest cost of supplying the good, so the lowest willingness to accept. Okay? All right. So then, for instance, you could go and you could say, well, as a social dictator, let me choose Q1 as the total units that are going to be supplied in the market. Okay? What's the surplus in this economy created? Well, for that one unit, it's going to be the difference between the value created to this marginal consumer and the cost to the marginal producer, right? And if I can do that, since I produce Q1, the surplus created in this market would be this area here, right? It's not a market anymore. The surplus created in this benevolent dictatorship would be that amount here. Okay? But now, since I'm a benevolent dictator, I want to achieve the highest possible surplus. Well, how would I do that? Theo? Andrew. No, Theo is you. Well, the price has nothing to do with it right now because I'm a benevolent dictator, right? But I certainly wouldn't stick here, right? Because if I stick here, if I just went one unit higher, I would get this in addition, right? And so I can do that until I get here to the market clearing quantity. Why don't I do it further? Why don't I say, oh, let's go to Q star plus 1, right? Because then this is the value that goes to this consumer that you give it to. But this is the cost to the firm, right, to the supplier, so there would be this amount lost. Does that make sense? Okay? All right. So the value that achieves the highest surplus here in this benevolent dictatorship would be this quantity here, where the total surplus would be everything that I marked up here. Okay? Now what is the market clearing quantity in this market? well, that's also the market clearing quantity. Right? So if we let the market do its magic, then this will also be the quantity that the market will get us to. Okay? And if we let the market do its magic, it will do so at this price here, and it will make sure that the people who receive this good are the ones who value it the most, and the firms supplying it the most are the ones for whom the costs of supplying it are the least. Right? So there's a lot of really attractive things about that. Right? Why might the benevolent dictator though have, like, what? So there's a lot of really attractive things about this solution, but nevertheless, like the benevolent dictator, if he can solve this information problem, if he doesn't have that problem of actually, determining who likes the good, how much, and what the costs of the different firms are, the benevolent dictator could do more than the market does. Like in the market, right, this area here goes to the firms, and this area here goes to the workers, to the consumers, right? The benevolent dictator so the market gives you kind of a very clear allocation of resources. The benevolent dictator with perfect information could do things that the market cannot do. Right? For instance, it could force all the firms to produce up to Q star and then give the entire surplus to the consumers. Does that make sense? Right? So I think there's two important things to remember here is, one, the market is really good at solving this problem of finding the efficient, right, the highest surplus quantity, and getting it to the people who value it the most and making those people produce it who have the least costs. The market is excellent at that. But it also implies a distribution of who gets the resources in this economy, right? That is not necessarily what, a policymaker or your sense of justice or so on would dictate. Demi. The willingness to accept. Okay? The willingness to accept, you're going to, once we talk about what underlies a supply function, it will make more sense to you while I'm talking about costs now. For now, you should just think about it as the willingness to accept, right? So and why is that related to the costs? Well, if I can produce a good at a cost of $4, right, and somebody else offers me $5 for it, I should be willing to accept that deal, right? So, in fact, I should be willing to accept everything up to the lower bound of $4. What is your name? Alexandra, yes. Okay, so the benevolent dictator, right? I'm the benevolent dictator. I know how much you like coffee, all of you, right? Let's say I solve that problem. I also solve the problem of, I know how much it costs to produce this coffee to anybody out there, right? Okay, so in the market, if I want to achieve the market solution, all of you have to pay me $5. All of those who get the coffee have to pay me $5, right? That's in the market. And then they all get the coffee. Great. But these $5 go to the producers. If I'm a benevolent dictator that actually can impose a solution, I could give this coffee to everybody who really wants the coffee, and they wouldn't have to pay for it, right? And what would be the surplus going to these consumers then? It would be that total area. Does that make sense? I would just compensate the supply. In my mind, I was compensating suppliers just for their cost. If I don't even compensate them for their cost, I just put a gun to their head and make them brew coffee, then the consumers would get this area here as well, right? But that seems rather unfair. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So what the power of the market solution here is to actually achieve what is an efficient solution, right? So to make sure that the quantities produced are the quantities that maximize the joint surplus created in this market, and to make sure that those suppliers who produce it are the ones who have the least willingness to accept, and those people who get to drink the coffee are those who have the highest need for it as measured in dollars. but it also implies something about who gets the stuff. And you might or might not find that solution, like that allocation, equitable. Right? Yes. Song Yis. Liz. Great.
The area under the supply,
This thing?
you say it's the cost.
Let's talk about what where the willingness to accept comes from later. Like by later, I mean in a few lectures. Like after the midterm, probably. Okay. Right. It's closely, just to give you some answer to this, it's very closely related to the cost. But it's not necessarily exactly the cost. Okay. Alright, so the willingness to accept, this total surplus is maximized when all units for which the willingness to pay exceeds the willingness to accept are exchanged, and no more. Okay. It is equal to to competitive equilibrium. Okay. Well, okay. But it does. But it's not. But it also this competitive equilibrium, because it specifies a price, also specifies exactly who gets what. Right? Which consumer gets the coffee, which firm gets the coffee, and how much do they get paid for it? And that might or might not be something that you find equitable or fair or something like that. Okay? All right. So now let's just think a little bit about that. If we compare different markets, right? Which markets, what I'm asking here is basically which markets create the highest total surplus, right? Okay? So what I'm thinking about is, okay, let's consider a market. Okay, there's supply and demand. There's like quantities exchanged here. Okay? And I want to know, let's keep the total quantity exchange constant. And we're now going to just rotate the supply and the demand functions. We're going to make them more or less elastic. We want to compare markets, and we want to know which markets create more or less surplus. Okay? So question 1. Let's say for a given quantity exchange, so we're keeping that quantity here constant, and we're going to rotate the demand function. Okay? How does consumer surplus vary with the elasticity of demand? What is your name? Nick. More what? Okay, so more in if it becomes less elastic, right? Okay, same thing, I guess. So I think it's just as well. It just seems that you went. Well, it doesn't matter. Okay, so if the demand function becomes less elastic, so it becomes steeper, then the surplus in this market, the consumer surplus in this market would start increasing, right? How would it affect the producer surplus? It wouldn't affect the producer surplus at all, right? Because the price is still the same, right? The producer surplus wouldn't be affected by that at all. So the elasticity of demand is, if the demand becomes less elastic, the total surplus in this market goes up, right? So if we don't allow people to buy goods in a market in which they demand inelastically, right? Then they will lose more. Okay? Does that make sense? Now on the producer side, okay, let's take question 4. For a given quantity exchanged, how does the producer surplus vary with the elasticity of, that should be supply. Okay, so question 4, for a given quantity exchanged, how does the producer surplus vary with the elasticity of supply?
If the elasticity of supply is more elastic, then the surplus will increase.
Okay, so the function, because if it's more elastic, the function will become flatter, right? Okay. If it's less elastic, the surplus increases. That's what you meant, right? Exactly. Okay. So for a given quantity exchanged, if if the elasticity of supply declines, so the supply function becomes steeper, the producer surplus will increase, right? Because I'm now thinking about the function kind of becoming steeper like that. All these inframarginal units, these people would have been willing to supply at really low prices already, but they are compared to a more elastic supply function, right? So generally in a market, if supply or demand are less elastic, become less elastic, and we keep the quantities exchanged the same, so we rotate either, the total surplus in that market will increase, right? So shutting down markets because you don't like the consequences of having a market for some reason, if you think about producer and consumer surplus, that's going to create a lot of losses to the economy if demand and supply are very inelastic, right? Make sense? So shutting down the market for heroin, right? Is that going to create a lot of lost consumer surplus, according to this analysis, or not? Yes. Why? Demand is quite inelastic, right? So if you actually make the market for heroin illegal, and let's say you can enforce it, okay, then it would lead to a large consumer surplus lost. Of course, we're ignoring all of the other societal aspects of having a market for heroin. Okay, right? It also means that the people who can buy it have a large incentive to try to actually circumvent the prohibition, right? All these people who can't buy their heroin in a legal market, they have a lot of incentive to go and buy it in an illegal market. So you're going to have a real tough time actually enforcing the prohibition of such a market, right? Which is exactly what we are seeing. Okay. All right. What happens if either of these functions becomes infinitely elastic? Let's say the supply function becomes infinitely elastic, Nick. So if the supply function is infinitely elastic, there is no more surplus for the producers, but there might still be surplus for the consumers, right? If the demand function becomes, if both of them become infinitely elastic, we are kind of in trouble with finding an equilibrium, right? We just have two flat lines, right? If the demand function becomes infinitely elastic, then there's no more surplus for consumers, right? Okay. Questions? Questions? Nope. Not yet. Okay. So, we're moving right ahead. There are no questions, so I can. Okay, so now we have thought about supply and demand. We have thought about surplus in supply and demand. And now we're going to, and we have thought about how that is related to the competitive equilibrium, and how basically an efficient solution, something that a benevolent dictator might impose, might be related to the competitive market clearing solution, right? We've pointed out that the competitive market clearing solution is efficient, so it maximizes the total surplus, if that's your definition of efficient. But it also implies a very specific division of the surplus between producers and suppliers. Producers and consumers, suppliers and demanders. Okay. So what we want to do now is we want to think about a particular instrument that this the government or the benevolent dictator might use to try to achieve a different division of surplus and a different allocation, right? So before I was talking about this benevolent dictator, and that benevolent dictator can basically just decide who gets the coffee and knows everything there is to know about the market, who has the high costs, who has the low costs. So clearly that's not the case, right? Any of you, when I asked you about how much you like coffee, could have lied to me, right? And in fact, if you thought that it actually had any influence on whether you actually receive coffee, you will have lied to me, okay? No coffee for you. So what happens now is we're going to think about a situation in which this dictator, this social planner, might want to use price regulations to interfere with the work of the market, and then we're going to think about what the implications are. Okay? So what's a price regulation? Right? Actually, this goes back to just the definition of consumer and producer surplus. So what I'm going to think about as a running example is a price ceiling. Right? What's a price ceiling? Andrew.
It's the maximum price that you set.
Yeah, so it imposes a maximum on the price that can be charged in the market. So you let everybody do whatever they want to do, but you say what you cannot set a price above X. What kind of markets do tend to have that kind of a situation? What is your name? Maddie. Rent control is kind of the textbook example for that, right? For some reason or another, governments decide to impose rent controls, and rent controls are rules that prevent prices for housing, for apartments, for rental apartments, not for purchasing apartments, right, for condos, but just for rental apartments to go above a certain level. Okay? All right. The opposite would be a price floor. What's maybe the most famous kind of politically discussed price floor? C something, right? No. Okay, what's your name? Florence. There's a C in there. The minimum wage is the typical example for that. That one gets discussed all the time, right? So that's a rule that in the market for labor, the wage is not allowed. You're not allowed to employ somebody for a wage below some floor, even if that person would be perfectly happy to work at a lower wage. Okay? All right. Okay. So in the simplest supply and demand model, well, the consequences on the quantities are clear, right? But let's just talk them through for a second here. Okay. I think we already talked about that, but in the simplest supply and demand model, okay, if the price ceiling is above the competitive equilibrium, what happens? Nothing at all, right? If the price ceiling is high enough, nothing is going to happen. Okay? Well, because at that level there is an excess supply, but the excess supply leads to prices to actually be bid down towards the competitive allocation. Okay? However, if the price ceiling is below, right, then the situation that we have is that the willingness to accept at the price ceiling, or the quantity units that the firms are willing to supply at whatever that ceiling is, I'm going to call it P upper bar, okay, right, is given by QS of P upper bar, right? That's a supply function. The quantities that somebody would like to buy would be given by QT upper bar, and there's going to be an excess demand. Okay? Supply will fall short of demand. Okay? Yes, Shannon.
At the previous price ceiling, you said there were no repercussions, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then wouldn't that be limiting consumer surplus?
No, because at this, if this is the price ceiling, the previous price ceiling, right? If there's a price ceiling in place, nobody prevents exchange at lower prices, right? So what would happen is that actually they would all just ignore that rule, and P star would be the competitive equilibrium price. Okay? All right. So what's the quantity exchanged in this market here? at the price ceiling? QS of upper bar, right? So this would be the quantity exchanged. Who exchanges this quantity? Who gets this quantity? Like, who supplies the quantity? Everybody with a willingness to accept below P upper bar, right? Okay, so the producer surplus in the market would be? What's your name? Say, Kareem? Reem, just Reem. Okay.
If the producer surplus is from P bar below.
So below until
the supply.
Until the supply function, exactly. Right. So that's the producer surplus now. Okay. What's the consumer surplus? Okay. So actually, first, who gets the good? In the middle, what is your name? Say again? Marshall. So who would get the good? So those people get the good are those consumers who are willing to pay then more than P bar. But how many of them are there?
It's from above P bar to...
No, who gets the good is the question right now. So at P upper bar, how many consumers are there who are willing to purchase this good? This many, right? How many of them can get the good? Only this much. So who gets it? What is your answer to the question, who gets it?
It's going to be, it depends on the supplier preferences, or if it's from producer, or it's not going to have
There is no rule who gets it. That's exactly, what was your answer? What is your name? Farah, that's exactly right. Farah is having got it like I couldn't have said it any better. There's no rule here that determines who gets these goods, right? We didn't impose that the people who get the goods are the ones who really want it, right? But for instance, if this was the market for coffee and I just put up 10 coffees here, but 50 of you want it, well, the people who would get those coffees are the ones who are fastest to the table, right? So there's no rule at this point. We haven't imposed any rule. Since we haven't imposed any rule, we don't know who gets it, and we don't know the willingness to pay of those who get it, right, Theo?
I'm not thinking if 50 people want to take coffees, will you increase the price of coffee?
Because the government, in its infinite wisdom, for some reason decided that you are not allowed to do that, right? So if you do it, they take you in a room and like beat you up or something, okay? So this is, I'm not saying this is what you should do, I'm just saying let's assume, I mean there are places out around there with rent controls, right? Okay. Well, Lucy.
At this point, we're assuming that there aren't any laws to bar like producer preferences, right? 'Cause
To bar producer.
Yeah, like you can't. I mean, they'll say like producer preferences. A lot of textbooks will use like racism as an example, right? But
Yeah.
like there are laws to prevent that. But in our case, right now, there aren't. Right?
I don't see the rule, like, so you could say, right, I don't know what this is, but you could say that maybe these producers are racist, right? So the rule that they're going to use is that they only going to sell their good to the blondest, most blue-eyed person that they can find, right? And then they're going to go down from there. But that's not necessarily the person who would have the highest willingness to pay. Right? So right now I have said nothing what leads to this allocation. So anything could be. Maybe we are living in like some sort of maybe this artificial world that we are thinking about here is a world where these producers are very racist, and they will then prefer to sell their good to, you know, I don't know, whoever has the right creed, whoever has the right gender, has the right, by right I mean whatever gender they like, right? Whoever like speaks the right dialects, I don't know, right? Whoever comes first in the morning, whoever is willing to stay the longest in line, right? Whoever is willing to pay them the most compliments, right? Yes.
But there's going to be a black market, right?
Well, let's just say that this market here can be enforced, right? If we allow for a black market, right, then what that basically means is that we are saying, well, there's a price ceiling, but nobody gives a whatever, right? Okay. All right. So let's now assume, and it should be clear how difficult that is to enforce, that the people who get the good are actually the people who want it the most. Okay? And it should be clear that that's not a trivial thing to achieve, right? Well, what would happen in this market then? The people who get the good, the people who want the good the most, who have the highest willingness to pay, are the ones that are at the, like that's sitting to the left of this demand function, right? So that would be all, like these people on the demand function to the left of QS would get it. What would be the consumer surplus then?
From P-bar all the way up. Well, from P-bar.
From P-bar, it would be this area here, right? It's no mystery. Suspense is rising. No. Okay. All right. So that would be the consumer surplus now. Okay. All right. Is the sum of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus in this market higher or lower than in the competitive equilibrium?
Lower.
It has to be lower because the competitive equilibrium achieves the maximum. It's lower by this triangle, right? That triangle is called the dead weight loss. Okay? This is the loss in consumer and producer surplus, assuming that you could perfectly resolve the problem of who to allocate the surplus, the shortfall to, the good that's rationed to, right? So that's already taking a very positive assumption. It's in some sense the minimum loss that's going to be made here. The minimum dead weight loss from a price regulation. Right? And why does that happen? Well, because the price is not being used to allocate resource. Like, why is it the minimum and not like just what the dead weight loss is? Well, that happens because when we use the price system, we allow people to just sort into those who are willing to pay more for it or less, and that's going to assign the good. But that rule, when you have a price regulation, has been set out of force? Out of force, I guess is the right expression. Right? What is your name? David.
Yeah. In this case, if you look at it with the dead weight loss,
yeah,
consumer surplus actually goes up.
So in this case, it's possible. So now let's think about who loses and who wins, right? Okay. So if we think about who loses and who wins, right? The producers clearly lose, right? When I mean who loses and who wins, I mean in comparison to a competitive equilibrium allocation, right? Beforehand, the consumer surplus was this triangle here. The producer surplus is this entire triangle here, all of this, right? Okay, so the producers now lose this box here. Why? Because that goes to the consumers, right? Assuming that you get the right consumers to get the good. And they lose this triangle here. Why is that triangle lost? Because some producers who were of relatively low, of relatively high willingness to accept, right, but still below what the competitive equilibrium price was, are not allowed to produce anymore. Okay? How about the consumers? The consumers gain this, right? And they lose this triangle here. So it's possible that the consumers are actually better off, right? And that's often the rationale for these type of policies. Okay? Make sense? Yes?
Losing the upper triangle. Why are they?
Okay, so the problem might be that I'm trying to do too much on this one graph. It's slowly becoming just a lot of chalk. So let's just do this again, right? Okay. So okay, we're going to put a price ceiling in here. We're going to assume that that this government or something, that somehow the people who get the good are the ones who value it the most, right? Okay, so now this was the competitive equilibrium. Okay, so now we're going to make some areas here. Okay, and we call them A, B, C, D, E, F. Okay, so what is the producer surplus in the competitive equilibrium? So I'm going to call that PS star for competitive equilibrium. It's which areas? Farah? DF and? Okay, so that's going to be the sum of D plus E plus F, right? And the consumer surplus in the competitive equilibrium is? A plus B plus C. Okay. Now, under the price ceiling, the producer surplus is going to be? Penelope? No, under the price ceiling. So the price ceiling is here, right? It's just going to be F, right? Okay, so they lose this D and E. Okay. Now the consumer surplus is going to be what? ABD, yes, I agree with that. Okay. Why not C? How was C generated before? Well, somebody was sitting on the demand function here, had a willingness to pay of, let's say, P star plus $1, right? And was able to buy it at P star, so this distance was $1 and he got that surplus. But he's not able to buy the good at that price anymore. He's not able to buy the good at all anymore, right? So therefore this is lost. So the deadweight loss is C plus E, right? Now, as David correctly points out, well, whether or not the consumers are better off depends on comparing D with C, right? Consumers are better off if this rent that's being transferred from the producers, right, this value that's being transferred from the producers because of the price regulation is larger than C. Okay? All of this, again, assuming that the consumers who get the good are the ones who actually value it the most. Okay? Yes, Noah.
So there cannot be a situation where the producers end up with
Not if there's a price ceiling, right? In a price ceiling, that's not going to happen, right? Because the producers are for sure going to have to sell whatever they sell at a lower price. So whoever still sells is going to lose some, right? And then some of these producers are just going to say, like, at this price, I'd rather play golf, right? Okay? Does that make sense? Yes. What's your name? Alice. C and D. E, this area here. Okay, so what's the under the price ceiling? The quantity exchanged is Q upper bar. Beforehand, under the competitive equilibrium, the quantity exchanged was Q star. Right? Yes? Okay. So now think about that. When you take N, so there's less units exchanged. What's the value of these units exchanged in the competitive equilibrium? A unit that was exchanged before, the person receiving it had a willingness to pay that exceeds the willingness to accept of the person selling it, right? The difference was the surplus. That's this distance here. Okay? But you prevent these trades from happening if you have a price ceiling. Okay? So therefore that distance here is now in the price ceiling is now lost. Right? Why? How does it break down between C and E? Well, C was the gains that the consumers had from trading before. right? Because it was their willingness to pay minus the competitive equilibrium. E was the gain that the producers had from selling, because it was the willingness to accept, was the price minus the willingness to accept, right? And that's called the dead weight loss, right? It's just like by making this price ceiling, that's the minimum amount of value you're gonna destroy in the market in gains of trade, right? You're not allowing some trades from happening where both parties would be better off. Because you're not allowing those trades from happening, right, you're destroying value. Wow. All right? But of course, I mean, if you, for some reason, prefer the people selling, buying the good to the people selling, so then maybe there's a good public policy rationale for doing this, right? Now, the problem, though, is that the next problem, though, is that we talked about at some length was that, well, if that's true, then it's still the case that there are people out there who would like to purchase the good at this price and can't, right? So what will start happening is that there will be attempts to realize these gains from trade that go outside of the system, black markets, bribes. Maybe the suppliers are going to start undercutting the regulations that exist for the apartments that they want to rent out. They don't invest as much to keep them in good state. This kind of stuff. Okay. All right. This is where we're going to keep. This is where we're going to take it up again next time.
Do we not have to answer this question?
Oh, did I put it up? No.
No?
No.